But it gives me great pleasure to introduce our last speaker of the day, which is Dion Gosling. Dion is a principal architect director for Studio 106. But many of you may remember Dion as a former New Zealand international with the Black Sticks. But upon retiring in 2005, Dion combined his passion of sports with architecture and established Studio 106 to specialise in the design and delivery of sport and community projects. So with many years embedded in sport, he has extensive knowledge and empathy for the sort of projects that we're trying to deliver. So Dion's going to share his thoughts on how to achieve the best possible design and use outcomes from new developments, redevelopments and extensions. So welcome Dion, thank you.
Thank you. I get the drive time slot, so hopefully we can share. I'd like to share with you some pictures, a little bit of theory, and take you through an idea around what is fit for purpose facilities. The really interesting thing for us is that we're at the intersection of sport and community, and I think that there's been a bit of chat over the day around that role of community in terms of potentially some other non-sporting users. And the analogy of that intersection is quite an exciting one. I mean, we all understand an intersection as a meeting of different roads, but in terms of people, we in all of our work, I'm sure you've come across a great bunch of people that you end up connecting with. There are some clashes or crashes that happen at intersections, and the Auckland analogy is really around that Panmure roundabout. I mean, it's such a nightmare actually. You almost jump on it and get kind of spun around it, and you hope that you can kind of get away from it. And from that point of view, it's almost the outside, the beyond intersection spaces that offer up some really interesting patterns and connections. So I want to just have a look at a couple of focus areas, specifically around the fit for purpose design. What is this about? Design, how come? And we've heard from Craig, we should put it in the rubbish can, wait for a little bit later. We don't want to spend any money on that. We don't want to do anything at all. He's got some very valid points, and I want to just segue some of his comments into where that might sit within design. Staying alive to fight the good design fight. Why would we want to introduce or try and understand good design in terms of the facilities that we're developing? And hopefully I can share across the projects that we've done some case studies, some thoughts, and just give you a little bit of a background into how that might work on a community level, also a regional level, and then a very local level, and how, from an architectural point of view or a design point of view, how we might kind of help to connect people, because ultimately that's what we're in the business of doing, trying to connect people into these facilities. Fields and buildings. You know, when I say facilities, I kind of encompass everything involved in there, not just a building, a bricks and mortar. And does it really matter? I think that's the other part of it. Just want to touch on some of the key influences that we will come across, and pretty much you guys in this room are those people, as well as the people that we work to try and get involved. This idea that I've come to the conclusion really around the facilities that we develop in this sector are unique projects. It's not a standalone typology of building. From our point of view, it's a unique project. It has some unique characteristics and some challenges that go with it, and I'd like to be able to share those with you. Where do they sit within the building hierarchy? Now, I think that there's some aspects about the scale that we've talked about. Where do they sit in terms of, particularly say from an Auckland context, around a regional strategy and how we develop those sport-wide, but also as a whole group of facility infrastructure that's trying to serve our city and serve our users. What have we learned? I certainly want to share some of those aspects to you, and then where can we go to from here? Because we kind of understand the what is now. You know, what is the current model, what is now, but then we also want to have a little bit of look about, you know, what can be, and particularly turning those learnings into reality and try and move forward. So I'll come back to this, but I just wanted to present this to you. This is kind of the whole idea of what we do is if we can kind of get that social and that economic functionality kind of working, and we've Merv's questioned the whole idea of sustainability, but if we can kind of get the functionality working from a social point of view, from a user point of view, we can make it fit for purpose, and I'll go on to that a little bit as well, just around in terms of how we maintain the buildings and how we look to kind of plan for renewals of facilities, and And that whole question around user flexibility, this magic word, user flexibility, I get this all the time. It's designed for maximum flexibility across trying to understand what is that around a brief development and what do we need to be able to deliver. So some key impactors, which is all of you people. And this is a little bit of an ingredient in terms of the type of building that we're trying to create. There's a mass number of people that come into the pot and all have an opinion, which is really exciting because everybody has an experience and a thought process about what a successful project or facility might be. The key aspect to all of this is building momentum. Right from the stuff that Craig does in terms of understanding a bit of a needs and some analysis through to what Steve was saying. Steve's going to give us a whole lot of money that we can kind of throw in. We take some learnings from international examples, then eventually we kind of pull them into some stuff that we're doing. So it is about building momentum, particularly around the volunteer inputs that we get and trying to create a bit of energy and through that. It's bloody tough work, when you're trying to start this journey from year zero and it can take 12, 15 years to actually, before you cut the ribbon. Building momentum's incredibly important. Who cares about design anyway? So what are these facilities and what is the mix of them and what are we going to look to bring? There's certainly a commercial aspect and I think Craig touched on it around the Reserves Act, which does present some challenges, but we understand that there needs to be a potential commercial element to it. Is there some intermediate spaces and how do we look to connect something around a commercial into the exterior? The housing, now I put the housing in there because in terms of an innovative progress about what is now and what can be, this sort of what role can housing play, particularly in Auckland. We've got such a scarcity of recreational space land. How can we hook into some of the density of housing developments that are taking place? And I know council are starting to do that through some development contributions and how we can kind of steer potentially some of this funding into some sporting and community infrastructure. We're starting to see something like this around Alexandra Park, for example, where we're starting to say, well, how can we actually use some of this recreation space and get some use out of it and create some housing and create some immediacy in terms of use there. I was listening to a podcast a couple of days ago around what they're doing in London around trying to get some investment for their new tunnel networks. They've got 2 tunnel networks which they're trying to open up other parts of London. And what they're looking at doing is trying to create this kind of financial model where they can leverage off some of the value in this land that opens up in terms of being able to service by the infrastructure and load that back into some of their other projects. And wouldn't it be fantastic if we could kind of sell that from the basis of, here's our sport and recreation space, this is awesome value. You guys want to come and load your dense housing development in here, great, give us some of that money and we'll invest it in here and we'll allow that kind of sharing basis. So housing. Office stuff, now we're probably not going to get twisted in the neck about this sort of thing, but the office space is really important. And what we're seeing more and more is how can we open up some day-to-day use in terms of office space and attract some revenue or within those downtimes in terms of how we use the facility. I'll come back to that because it's a really interesting thing. Sure, yep, there's indoor space. We know we've got to have some indoor parts to it. There's some outdoor parts to it. And all of this has an aspect of design into it. And I'll touch on a little bit around the ability in terms of material selections, in terms of how we might maintain it. What are some of the aesthetics, that go through. Education, huge part of the facility stuff that we do. I think that the component of how we can hook up with the education, we talk about literally in terms of connecting in with schools, having facilities on the periphery of a school site that we can connect into and allow that day-to-day use, but also within the facility as well. How can we connect in and provide educational space? So we've got to be able to understand in terms of, from a design point of view, what are education spaces and how might that look in a sports facility. Retail. Some of the triggers and learnings, from a design perspective and with retailers, how do people approach it? How do people come in, confront, they're gathering a bit of information and knowledge on what is in front of them. What do they want to see and do that will allow them to actually step a little bit further beyond that threshold, come in and engage. Engagement in our facilities is huge. We want people to play a game, come back, come in and socialise and use it as a social hub, which helps with that whole kind of social functionality that I was talking about before. What can we pick up from that? We're probably not going to have that as a tennis club, but we can probably take some learnings around some of those aspects as well. Where do we sit within sort of the stream of facilities? And I just think it's really worthwhile while we kind of pigeonhole sometimes. Is it local? Is it regional? Is it national? Where does it sit? In terms of the community project, could potentially sit through here. I think at this high end, we talked about Eden Park before. There's some national significance in terms of development of those sort of facilities. Certainly some of those activities end up hooking into this, and we kind of hear of that sales pitch, connecting the high performance with the community. Come in and you'll kind of get to meet your cricket guy, your All Black, so there's definitely some sort of opportunity there in terms of connecting through there. Likewise on the regional level, there's a commercial and growth aspect that ends up hooking in through here. The other one that kind of sits on this side, which really interests us at the moment in terms of trying to help people engage with a community facility, is that idea of the domestic scale. How can you kind of introduce this idea of privacy and home, things we really understand in terms of intimacy and the ability to feel comfortable and safe in our environment, some of the warmth and textures that you have in your own house. How can we get that into a facility to allow people to use it? And that's particularly relevant on the usage, so the downtimes. Monday, Tuesday night, how can kind of the three of us sit around a table in a big hall like this and feel comfortable and engaged enough to be able to stay and socialise? And how might it function on a Saturday afternoon when it's absolutely heaving? In terms of usage, how can we pull into that? And I think Craig landed one on me when he was talking about flexible space, operable walls, so I'll touch on that one a little bit later as well. Coming back to that again, is around vision creation with this social and economic functionality are probably the key things. And tied in with that domestic thing, we've got this term we're running at the moment around collective intimacy, collective in terms of that community, but then intimacy in terms of how do we deal with spaces and make spaces a little bit more comfortable for people, so we're not walking into the big open shed and feel really uncomfortable about being there and feeling as though we actually want to stay. And it's actually, in terms of what we can learn from these guys is around that idea of user experience. How can we create a user experience to drive people in from a design point of view? That whole idea of retail frontage, being able to come in, take people into the building, into the facility, make them stop, enjoy, socialise, engage, user experience. So we've all kind of seen variations on this type of thing where, for all the design work in the world, we kind of draw a pretty picture and kind of go, yeah, that's awesome. Ultimately, the users are going to decide whatever they want to do. So, from our point of view, this sort of, it's very difficult to actually understand. There's no silver bullet or paper that tells us how to design like that. And one of the stories we went back to Colmar, Papatoa, a year after they opened up, and we took some footage in that building just to really see how it would work. And I think Len mentioned there were 7 or 8 initial sports groups that were involved, and in that year on, the number has just grown in terms of the non-traditional sports or the community people that came back. And what we saw when we were walking around there, for those that know, you go in the ground floor, you go up some stairs, and we kind of have this reasonably wide concourse or central space. So you walk up the stairs, there's memorabilia up there, there's a function room on one side and another one on the other side. So we had this kind of intermediate space that would link the two of them in a big event, but would kind of be like a lounge or a place that people could have conversations. What we ended up seeing up there was this group of kids who came up and they had their radio there. There's only about 5 of them, and they were in the 80s, we called this breakdancing. I don't know what the term is now, but they were there kind of doing their swirls and stuff on the concrete. The light was coming in the west window, and it just kind of there was no way we ever would have been able to design or think that space would be used by that. But here was a space that these kids came up and they felt safe that they could do it. They felt it had a scale that they could do it, and they didn't feel threatened. And that was an ability to be able to kind of come through on a weekday and use the space, occupy it, and they kind of drove that purely out of a user experience. It was awesome to see. There's no way I would have dreamed up that in the design brief. So where does it sit within your project? So Craig talked a little bit about, actually he mentioned some numbers. He mentioned $1.4 million spent on early design fees. I've got to go and have a chat to him and figure out where that actually comes from. I haven't seen it. The glossy concept, and it's really just reinforcing that. The whole thing about building momentum is to take small steps. You don't need to pay 20 grand first up to try and get the project underway. Craig suggested a little A4 type thing, a conversation starter. So I often refer to that as the coffee table document. I think it probably needs to be A3, just a little bit more, so you put it on a table and everyone can see it. But it's a bit of a starter. It just triggers conversations. It doesn't mean there's a set result to start with, and it just means that you're able to open up conversations, and it's actually incredible to see where that little document goes to. It can start off with a small group of 3 people, but we've found that it can travel through local boards, council, funders. That little bit of A3 document with some other supporting stuff and stories and conversations in behind it actually really triggers off quite a lot of positivity in terms of where you're going. Developing the brief is hugely important, and it's largely driven around that idea of understanding what the functional specification is. So functional specification, we kind of mean like what are the needs and what does that translate down into usable space areas. So we would kind of pull that down, understanding the modes of use, say in a day-to-day use, and then a function or an event space. And out of that we kind of get a schedule of areas, schedule of spaces we would call it, and we would kind of largely understand what those sort of relationships could be. Where are the possibilities? Where are the interactions taking place? Again, that whole intersection kind of idea. Where does design take place? I think it's overlying all the time. I think just because we're all exposed to what we would consider design in terms of experience through our own engagement, our own understanding from the domestic, from our own house. Everyone's got an idea about what they've seen and what they've experienced on the sports field or in a building when you've been there. And actually, one of the best things to be able to do is when you're developing your facility is actually to visit other sites. And I think that's come up once before, just to understand exactly what it is. But I'd challenge you not just to look and go, hey, that's an awesome deck, but actually challenge yourself to actually why do I like that deck? What is it about that deck? Is it the size? Is it the scale? Is it the time and space? Is it the elevation? Is it down at ground? Actually go beyond just that initial, hey, that memorabilia cabinet looks really good. What is it about it? Really drill down, and the deeper you can go in that brief and understanding what it is that brings on that experience, then the more powerful it will be and the better result that you'll get out of it. I've just put that up there. There's a lot of writing on that, but I think there was a handout on the table that was placed in there just in terms of some guidelines. And that reinforces the point really that design kind of comes in, more or less in quarter 3 when you're down here, but equally that kind of idea of the coffee table document can kind of start to progress and go around. I think there's been a number of diagrams shown today that talks about that loop, including that whole review and feedback loop that works through. So this really kind of dictates really around that actual detailed design phase, but the design process kind of keeps going. Some of the challenges and key questions, I'm sure that the practical stuff you guys are really interested in. So how do we get best value for money? We've fought really, really hard to try and get some money. Steve's clicked his fingers and another $5 million has kind of turned up somehow. What is the best use of that space? So just really want to talk about that bang for buck at a high level. Tying your business plan into the design process is absolutely critical. Absolutely critical. The two need to be able to run in parallel, and often when you say to groups, where's your business plan? If we've got the schedule of spaces kind of wrapped up, we roughly think what we're going to need. We need 20 square metres for this space, we need 200 square metres for that space. When you say that, can we see your business plan because we want to be able to wrap that in? They're actually, surprisingly, those business plans, they don't exist. We get told they do exist, but they don't exist. It's really key to be able to drive. What we end up with is our funding plan and a capital cost kind of sit over here. So you do that schedule of spaces. The QS spits out a number over here, which is always more than what you think it should be, but it includes a whole lot of stuff that maybe you haven't thought about. GST, contingency, fees, consenting, all sorts of bits and pieces that sit over here. So you have a funding plan which kind of sits there and aligns with that project cost. Sweet, we're into it. That feeds into the facility. But on the other side of things, once you built this thing, then you've got this whole idea of what are my revenue streams? How am I going to sustain this thing around an operational cost? The traditional approach has been, yeah, we can kind of look at some learnings and we get a bit of a gut feel about how this will go down and we'll filter into our building. Okay, we think we've got it reasonably right, let's build it. What we ended up doing with Trudy down at Fraser Park was see if we could actually engage in the two of them side by side and see if we could manipulate some data in terms of that schedule of areas to see what outcomes we get. So what I mean by that is that we would say, okay, well, do we need some office space? Yes, we do. Okay, well, what size is that office space? Who are you looking at going into there? We're looking at the local physio. She's really interested in coming in. Okay, what sort of rent is she looking at paying? Oh, maybe 12 grand a year. Okay, how's that going to work in terms of the amount that we've got available for them? And what that ended up doing was in a P&L across the first 4 years, we were able to kind of see that return on investment and how that might do. Then we went back into that model again and said, okay, well, if we decrease the size of that and maybe increase the size of the gym, the strength training room, what impact would that be? Strength training rooms are a really interesting beast. Everybody seems to want them, but in one example, we had it sitting up on a mezzanine level, to get a nice view out of an indoor space. But by the time we looked at the cost of that space, the extra structural support we needed to support the floor, what we needed to maintain the gear, get it in, the health and safety issues that came along with some of that gear, the room ended up kind of shrinking down a little bit, and then we said, well, does it actually meet the needs of the people coming and using it? Well, not really, so then it was so that was the financial model which we kind of worked into it, but then we still had to go back and because it was part of a briefing process that said we will have a gym of this, it took a little bit of renegotiation again, but at least at that stage we hadn't built the thing. At that stage it was really just manipulating a little bit of data within a concept. So then we kind of got to the stage where we felt reasonably comfortable about where the whole thing lay across revenue and operational cost, and then how that kind of filtered into an actual space. And we went back to the QS and he repriced it. Yep, we're kind of on the money, let's keep going. Let's get our consultants to do that detailed design. Very, very interesting. Open yourself up to new users. So I think we've talked about that in terms of being able to kind of not be closed off to opportunities from other groups. Hugely important. And the energy that those people can bring into the process as well, and knowledge is really, really important. Collaboration is key. So a lot of our projects that we do projects right across the country now, are in collaboration with other practices, other architecture practices, and other partners, strategic partners as well. It kind of comes around that whole idea of community and sharing and being open. And actually, from the client point of view, from the user point of view, whether it's whatever organisation you are, from a design point of view, you end up getting 2 for 1. You end up getting 2 practices or 2 architects or 2 designers for 1. Now, what that allows you to do is for the 2 of us to step back, go through that design process and have some really hard conversations with each other. We're able to step out of that hierarchy that might be available in just one practice. We have a director, a senior and a junior, and there's kind of maybe a bit of trepidation about really challenging some ideas maybe a director's got. In the model and the collaboration that we end up, we have some really tough decisions. It means that when we go back, we've tested it thoroughly and we can kind of present a united front to go, well, this is what we're thinking, this is where we should go. Collaborating is a huge bonus, I think, such a positive thing. Bang for buck, just looking at the idea of starting small and then slowly build the picture. It's all about that idea of momentum. We know that vision creation does need people, and the ideas, being able to pull that in and being able to get the engagement of the people around the table. Your project control group is hugely important as the project goes on. In terms of that engagement with the design team, what that allows you to do is to have people with some capability to be able to go back to filter down through the clubs and actually explain where you are at through that process. There's a lot of detail that ends up building up across the way, and it's good to be able to have that ability to be able to kind of have connections back with that project control group and filter back some of that knowledge. And it's amazing how 3 years morphs into 6 or maybe even 12. You know, you start off on the journeys, I'm sure you've all been part of projects that you thought you'd better whack out in 2 or 3 years, but 10 years you're still going through it. Simplicity and form. Now, a couple of design principles. The whole idea really around this idea of creating an iconic facility. We want to, and largely it can be politically driven, but often there's a drive within the group to maybe create something which is really right out there, and with that can come cost. I've saved no curved roofs in here. I know that we're in a curved building. Maybe it's just something I've got against curved roofs, but curved roofs do offer complexity in terms of where the rain falls. At some point, that curved roof is going to be flat. You know, rain gets on it. How are you going to clean it? Warranties get tied up in terms of the maintenance of those roofs. Our principle is really just around creating something reasonably straightforward. So this is a little project, I thought I'd share this, that we're doing just down a little town in Dunsandel, just out of Christchurch. A little community centre is about $3 million. And what we ended up looking at with this was how can we approach that idea of maintenance, of cleaning gutters. You know, the ability, particularly from a health and safety point of view, working at height, accessing up. We ended up with 2 gutters through here and through here. And looking at the roof, we wanted to keep it really, really simple, so we ended up with 2 or 3 pitches that were quite simple. And so we went through and had a look at the spaces. In here we've got a couple of multi-use flexible space meeting rooms. Got an entry with some offices in through here, some toilets tucked in the back through here. We didn't actually need to pay or want to pay for any additional wall space or volume that was going to occur up here. Into this area here we had a couple of little multi-use hall spaces. There's a local school that wanted to be able to use it for school productions. So we needed a bit of height and a bit of volume in terms of where we sat for lighting rigs, and acoustics were hugely important. So taking that functional specification that we had and trying to say, well, how can we then deliver a really super efficient building in terms of a roof form and provide a really safe maintenance plan that can go along with that building. And then from a materials point of view, we're just using just a brick veneer, something really hard or robust, and other robust materials might be a precast concrete, for example, or concrete block. But we felt in terms of where it was located with the amount of, or the typology of brick construction that was going on there from a domestic level, we just wanted to introduce that. So what that gave us is a really super easy way or construction material to be able to kind of hook into that. So just be really careful about that simplicity of form and that whole request to go, we want an iconic building, and thinking that iconic building is a whole lot of complex shapes with complex junctions, because it'll just add cost and maintenance problems with that. Multi-use spaces is worth a talk. In terms of a bigger space, how do you narrow it down? Now, one of the things we find is that we end up driving with that, with these operable walls that come in. I mean, there's a nice, really lovely big one running across there. I mean, in this event of things, they're expensive. They're hugely expensive in terms of acoustic properties, in terms of how they operate and the maintenance and the structure that's required to get there. They often end up being the first thing to be stripped out of the budget and put on the wish list item at the bottom. So what we need to be able to try and do is to work out how can we use the spaces with bringing that whole idea of collective intimacy back into it, and create it. Maybe there's some movable screens or some planting or some other way that we can bring in through here. Some rope screens perhaps that can subtly divide spaces that you can either pull back or maybe you can withdraw back up. Similar sort of thing. It doesn't give you the acoustic ability, but what it does give you is maybe an interim cheaper option to be able to create or subdivide that space. The ability then, what that allows you to do is to save some cost and maybe pick up some other areas, some softer, in this case, the use of timber, some areas that you can use to highlight a building or maybe just accent a couple of places. So, you know, so that for example, cedar cladding is $450 a square metre to load up into there. So you don't want to get too carried away on that sort of stuff, but you want to be able to be really careful about where you place it, because as people move through, that's the stuff that they're going to touch and they feel and they're going to come in with. The other thing, note on materials, is that by operating off a really simple neutral palette or low-level palette. There's all the other stuff which comes on board, which clubs and groups bring, so the memorabilia which they come and add in, the people, the colour, the culture, history and tradition which they end up bringing in. To me, that sort of stuff can add your colour, and it actually ends up being a little bit of ownership from those groups anyway. Talked a little bit about the intimacy around those boundaries and edges. This is an example of a project which we did, just bringing in some of those. So this is a main entry for you. So in this particular case, there's an axis running all the way through there, through the middle. We've got kind of a cafe or a meeting space, and we've ended up setting up some breakout spaces through here. Stairs going up. This is that memorabilia that we're talking about, providing little spaces or designated spaces that you can end up layering up a whole lot of stuff, and then introduce some mobility through some screening. Walking through here on some hard-wearing surfaces, changing that surface, you end up getting a slightly different feel, a bit of an intimate space that people can have. The other interesting thing around a cafe and these sort of spaces that we talked about in the context of say a common area, a common office area, or an admin space that people can fly in, fly out and be able to use. We've found in some projects that through the use of a cafe, for example, maybe changing the seating into some booth seating or some slightly fixed seating, changing the different model of that seating, you can sort of offer up that ability for people to fly in and use that space, feeling a little bit more enclosed, a little bit more comfortable about maybe having a one-on-one meeting or doing a bit of computer work, but they're out in essentially a public area, a public space. What does that do? It frees up some potential office space that we thought that we might be able to use dedicated for those fly-in, fly-outers, but we can actually probably rent that out at a much higher return to, say, an educational group or a sports-aligned organisation who's looking to come in. So you're just looking for little opportunities like that where through that needs assessment and that briefing, a group says, we really want this space. By challenging and testing, do we really need that space as an enclosed traditional space, or can we actually use to pull it out in that one as a cafe space? Designing for the environment, I think that there was a lot of talk around this ESD and sustainability, but certainly you want to maximise natural light, natural ventilation. It costs money to turn on lights all the time and get the facility going. As a design principle, it should be just pretty much standard practice. The 80-20 rule on HVAC design, we accept that 20% of the time when the facility is absolutely smoking, that the place is going to suffer a little bit in terms of the comfortable level. And the HVAC systems to cater for 100% of your operation means that for those 4 events of the year that you end up needing that, the system sits reasonably dormant for the rest of the time. Increased maintenance, increased warranties, it's not worth going, just so long as that everyone understands potentially that's where that impact could be. We talked a little bit about the ESD around solar generation. It's easy enough to put in cabling and put in that infrastructure to enable that to be clipped on later in terms of the staging plan. But effectively, like the operable wall, the idea of getting solar panels up on the roof ends up going down into that wish list item. Generally, that balance of the capital cost and return on the solar stuff hasn't quite got there. It's getting closer, and the buyback or feedback into the grid is marginal. So we just need to, in terms of filtering that into your business plan and the model, just have another wee look at that. The last point there around that was that down at Fraser Park Hutt City, we're having a look at an opportunity potentially with their all of their facilities in their region. Could they all have solar panels up there and look to capture that energy and feed it into the grid and then do it through a rebate as an organisation wide on all of their facilities? Again, each of the capital investment on each of those projects was at that stage, it was probably a couple of years ago, it was a bit tough to continue to get across the line. Bang for your buck. So the use of local support, we get asked this a lot. We've got Harry the plumber, he's a local guy, he's been with the club for a long time, we want to be able to get him into the project, can we do that? Someone has got some materials or a timber yard, or you want to get local builders involved in the project. Just be really cautious about how those people are brought in. In the end, we want to get a project when you come to build it with one point of contact, a single contractor to be able to deliver that. They're responsible for the delivery, the timing, and then the financial management of that project. What we've tended to find with that idea of local support is to gather a long list of trades and people that we can then include with the tender documentation, send that out to the main contractor, say, look, go for your life, contact these people, you make the decision if they're capable enough to be able to do things. The other part of that is around the construction climate at the moment. Harry the plumber might be awash with work, but when you come to build the facility in 2 years' time, maybe he's going to be struggling for work and can't actually afford to give you the materials and all of his labour totally free, like he told you when he was leaning on the bar the other night. So just be really cautious of that. Also affects some of the warranties and delivery. Flexible spaces, I've touched on that a little bit before in terms of the operable walls. Storage is the eternal battle, the costly battle. $3,500 a square metre for storage. It's often clubs and groups need storage. They're constantly short of storage. You do need storage in your facility for loose furniture, for parking away stuff, to be able to change in, change out different modes of your facility. I'm not sure if you absolutely need a whole lot of storage in your facility to be able to hold all the uniforms that generally get kept in people's garages overseas anyway. But there's some storage required in terms of sport functionally, operating in terms of training gear and apparatus. But storage is always a tough one to try and solve. Use of flexible spaces. So this was a project that we're working with Andrew down at the Akarana Marine Sports Centre, and what we wanted to try and do, big believer in being able to get multi-use out of spaces. I'm particularly referring to circulation that runs through all of our buildings. That ability is not just a hallway, but it's another space. How can we use it? And we set up the concept of being able to kind of draw the street, the idea of the street. We've got 2 pavilions which are effectively functionally driven around what the brief wanted, and then try and open up the middle of that then we can then feed off into these spaces. The other thing that this helped us with is in regards to developing a new community facility, is trying to draw the community in. By opening it up and creating a street that people could relate to, so like the laneways concept or the back of the street where they can work in a community in a safe sense, how can we use that kind of idea that people can relate to and bring that into a building design, which ultimately can help with the functionality of the project. That's a render just running through there. So what we ended up with is the street running through sort of a front end pavilion, a rear end pavilion, and then this ability to kind of create a little bit of drama through here with some a memorabilia or an opportunity to display and showcase what the groups were about. Some siting challenges around a central and a precinct model. So there's a number of different models that are working around at the moment. This one here, a central hub model where the hub is, all the buildings are located in the middle with all the fields wrapped around it. And the other one is the periphery, where we end up with a whole lot of buildings scattered around the side. And that's almost as a precinct. So the models that we've got here around that precinct model, Lloyd Elsmore Park, lots of different buildings scattered all around, lots of separate single users. Column Park's a little bit like that as well, a couple of key nodes that sit on there, and then the extended users on the outside. How do we get them to engage? What are the challenges with each of those models? Largely it's around what are the existing facilities and uses, what groups can come in and share. From a design point of view, we're able to bring in some of those networks and pathways to try and create the linkages between those buildings. So linkages and pathways, it's a bit of terminology really wrapped around that idea of the passive recreation. How can we use passive recreation and users to come onto the site and be able to wander around that site, connecting with each of those buildings and get exposed to some of the different sports that are happening is very, very powerful, but very, very simple to be able to do. The single story versus 2-story dilemma. How do you, this quest to get the upper level view out over the park versus everything being on the ground and perhaps a little bit sprawled. The 2-story offers us a few challenges in terms of accessibility and compliance. We end up having to pay 60 to 80 grand for a lift in there from an accessibility point of view. How often does that get used? If we've got a canteen down on the lower level and a kitchen on the upper level, how do we service that in terms of resource and the cost of that resource to actually operate that building? A model which we're sort of favouring a little bit at the moment, if we've got the space, is that idea of a podium. Can we still get that idea of raised and elevated views, but still largely remain on the ground, and introduce a podium which allows people to stand around the fields and still engage with sport as they do. But if you're back at the facility, then perhaps you can kind of get up almost on a deck, again, as we would in a home situation. Just elevate yourself. It makes an awesome seat that you can sit on. The kids can kind of play around and do whatever they need to do on there. So a few challenges just in terms of siting and a few things to think about. Stage developments. So I think we're all pretty much in the key that we need to be needs-based and not design-led at the initial stages. We want to be able to understand what that big picture is and what that master plan is to create us really a diagram on how we might look to proceed. What do we need to tick off first? What has the biggest priorities? Often it's your field-based or your court-based. We want to build that first, and then we can kind of add on some of the other aspects around the building and the function room. You might need to start off with some utility areas, some changing rooms, and then future-proof those in terms of developing function areas up the top. Considering some play zones and beyond play zones, a little bit of terminology, but that whole idea of that area that we end up playing in. I think I've got a diagram through here. So this whole idea, we were looking at sort of a master plan. In this case, this is for the Boroughs project, which was a partnership project between Spark and Council about delivering these 5 basketball courts around Auckland. We set up a proposition that said, okay, well, traditionally we have a play zone which is in here, but where are the other opportunities beyond that play zone? So we had a look at the intermediate potentially between some greenways, some park, what could occur in here. We've got a road most often, what could occur in through this space. Sometimes we might end up with some car parking, for example, what might happen in through there, and where are these key pathways and connections through the site, but also potentially with existing facilities. So that's kind of a diagram start in terms of what a coffee table document might be around. There's no level of detail in there. It's all about relationships and all about where are the opportunities to go. So are they a priority? How do we look to roll them out? What can we look to develop just a little bit later? The other part of all of that is within that brief and that master plan is to try and create, from a design point of view, we try and get this design DNA document. So as we go forward with this master plan, that design DNA document it's almost like a reference document that we can go back and kind of reassess on what's really important to us in terms of all of those connections, and then how might that inform the design process going forward. It's another little project, again, looking at potential zones that we could kind of give over to the community. So this is in Avondale, the Learn to Ride track. We had a look at different zones here that might kind of pick up on a few cues for the community. So sort of looking at, for example, some of the sea or the aquatic type environment, which was located on this side. We picked up some opportunities for some local artworks or what have you could be developed here, and then kind of making reference to the Avondale racecourse itself, which just kind of sat over through there. So out of this diagram with some of that concept idea, we could then take that later into a little bit of a detailed design where we could pick up some of those aspects. Hugely helpful, doesn't take a lot of time, doesn't cost a lot of money, but at least you've got something there as a bit of a principle. Then you end up with kind of eventually down the track of developing that picture up into that. So some of the lessons learned. So fit for purpose stuff, so great data. So one of the challenges we have is working through with the user group and getting the user group to offer back and being interactive in terms of that. Gathering that data, forming that great brief document is hugely important. The idea of that collective intimacy is something that you can look to add in around a user experience and look to be able to drive that in terms of design value. So where's your bang for your buck? You don't need to spend $450 a square metre on cedar throughout the whole exterior of the building, but you can just pick little bits and pieces that you may need. Simple is elegant, keep the cost down, keep the junctions very, very simple. Design for people. Those connections and pathways are hugely important, and there's sort of some of those subtleties that don't actually really cost a huge amount, but functionally really impact you when you end up getting through it. and staging, being able to pick those components that you need to do. So what can be? We've kind of touched a little bit on what is now and then what can be. So this just gives a little bit of insight. This is a project we've been working on the master plan down in Christchurch for Ngā Pūnawai. Interestingly, with the events that have happened down here, we've had a whole kind of population migration drift away from the eastern suburbs down towards the south and the west. So Christchurch City Council are looking at trying to develop on a greenfield site what a community hub might look like and what might feel like and what it costs. Interestingly, with that whole population drift down here, this being a whole lot of green, rural type land, we've seen a lot of those rural sports actually come into clash and conflict with the urban sports come down and how they connect. So we've got kind of A&P guys are up here. There's polo, equestrian, which were occurring here. I think we were grazing some sheep on here, and it was just trying to work out how that mix might go. But this model was really just largely driven by architecture and urban design. It wasn't driven by infrastructure and traffic. It made a huge difference. What this allowed us to do was to think about the people and those urban connections that I talked about. We ended up setting up a main transport hub and a link through here where the buses could come through locally and connect and drop off. So in a day-to-day mode, buses could just run through, drop people off. Local residents could kind of walk in, connect up. They'd be able to see and view what was happening on the facility, park their cars here during the day as a park and ride, hop on the bus, they'd be able to bus their way through. And we set up a hierarchy here of a ring road which would work around and act to service on a Saturday morning with little car park nodes all around the side, which just allow people to come in, park locally, work on the fields. What this also allowed us to do is during that event mode is to close down this ring road potentially, and with athletics being on there, we could run walking races could occur down through here, or triathlons or other events which kind of need a spectator experience of a loop. This is able to be created through here. One of the other key things which I'm a bit of a fan for, and is probably a little bit of a mark of some of my thinking, is really driven around that whole idea of the Olympic Boulevard. You know, where you go there and you just end up with this concourse, and either side are all these facilities. And the challenge is, how can you take that kind of idea and bring it into a community type situation? So what this allows us to do is to bring, we align this up with the entry so people can come in and actually get a view all the way through and still retain a visual connection in terms of what was happening from a rural point of view. It means that during an event, say for example for hockey, you can close this off here and down here and set this up as an event venue, run an expo, put some temporary facilities up there, get some people activating the space and celebrate an event that can occur through here. It would still allow an opportunity for buses to come in and drive in for VIP, but during the day, people using the hub building in here could actually come up, drive in, park locally and still activate with this. But there's a clear definition of hierarchy in terms of transport and traffic movement. Setting up some shared facilities, so grandstand which kind of looks over both hockey and athletics, and then tennis sits up here as well. Eventually we'll end up with an indoor facility a little bit higher that can kind of make views over here. Rugby league have come on now and they kind of occupy. So we end up with a bit of a hub concept, certainly driven around some of those urban connections that we've been thinking about. The natural grass fields working around the perimeter, and then just trying to establish some on-site kind of treatment of infrastructure and stormwater and that type of thing. So that's kind of a move of where we're going to at the moment. And I think that's probably it. The world is moving so fast that the person who says it can't be done is generally interrupted by someone doing it. We love that one.